How are you? Very well, thank you, yeah. So, for the last almost 20 years, I've been doing the same thing, which is I've been writing about how we address the planet's most pressing problems with new solutions, new innovations, better ideas. How do we, think our way out of the multiple interconnected crises that we face? And during that time, one of the things that kept puzzling me is how we could have so many brilliant innovations that are so poorly known, but that are also incorporated so seamlessly into strategies that change absolutely nothing. And one of the things that I started to realize is that you can't really talk about addressing these kinds of issues without thinking a little more deeply about what's going on. I think that the role of those of us who are trying to address these kinds of problems is in fact figuring out how we can make ourselves into good ancestors. And that's not something we're taught, really, in school or in work life. And particularly we're not taught it because in order to tackle that problem, we have to address the future. And the future is something that we really don't think clearly about at all. One of the things that I think we've seen in the past decade especially is all sorts of reports, documentaries, conferences, et cetera, that purport to address the future, right? But are actually there's very little difference between them. The future that they're presenting is very much a common one. And there tend to be some really dominant themes of things that people find really engaging that are really futuristic technologies that we think of as defining how we will engage with life tomorrow. And there's a lot of these, but they all sort of fit on the same kinds of lists, and we're familiar with all of them. There are things like, for example, the iPod, or the iPhone, video conferencing, brain uploads and neuroscience, robotics, robot cars, and sort of a transportation future that will lead us down a glorious highway. And, of course, space travel and other related ideas. We could all add to this list. The thing that you might notice that these all have in common is that these are all visions of tomorrow that have been around for a very long time. Right, this is a still from Voyage to the Moon, one of the very first motion pictures ever made. And when we look at these things, what we keep finding is that we live surrounded by visions of the future that are in fact older than anybody in this room. Right? The things that we think of as defining like futuristic, cool tomorrow are decrepit technologies. Right? And I started to really think, okay, how can it be that our future is quite literally a thing of the past? How did this come to pass? And I started really looking into the history of the future. And what I found, and what lots of other researchers have found as well, is that there are some really clear drivers here. One part of it is nostalgia. Like every other kind of business asset in the world, the means of futures production are concentrated in a very few hands, and those hands tend to be kind of wrinkled and old. Many of the people who call the decisions, call the shots about what kinds of futures we'll see, are people who grew up in, came of age really in the 50s and 60s. And so the kinds of futures that we tend to see again and again and again are the things that made sense to them when they were young. Right? Because one of the hallmarks of this crazy period of time that we're in is that every generation grows up with a complete disconnect from what it thought, from what the last generation thought about the future. As Margaret Mead said, we used to have a culture in which elders could say, you have never been old, but I was young, so let me tell you what to do. And now young people are like, yeah, but you were never young in the world I'm young in, right? Yet we still have, these really outdated, crazy ideas of what we're going to do. So people are still talking about, for example, colonizing Mars, right? This drawing here was literally made before I was born, right? So these are really deeply embedded ideas, but there's something more. And I think it's something that really we need to pay attention to. Who knows who this is? Thomas Edison, yes. Somebody gets a prize. Now, Thomas Edison, famous inventor, right? The light bulb, et cetera. We all know that he invented the phonograph, right? Except that he didn't. Emil Berliner actually invented the gramophone, which is pretty much the same damn thing, before him. What Edison did do, right, was get the patent for it. And it turns out that this is actually something that really he was very good at. He was kind of a crap inventor. He basically didn't really make anything, but he stole a hell of a lot of ideas really well, right? So, he gets credit for inventing the light bulb. There were at least 23 separate inventions of the incandescent light bulb before he patented it, right? But he had great lawyers, right? And he really knew how to get out there and move product, right? So here he is towards the end of his life, saying he wants to see, a phonograph in every American home, right? And it's worth thinking about what actually he and others of his generation and ilk did, because they did something that was very new. How do you sell something, right, whose benefits may not be apparently, immediately apparent, right, that may not have a clamoring need, that may, in fact, kind of run up against older traditions, so when the phonograph was first being marketed, people were talking about how, this was going to come up against family music nights, and it did. How many of us have family music night anymore, right? And what Edison figured out with the help of Bernays, one of those sort of real pioneers of public relations, was that when you want to sell people stuff like this, you don't sell them the features, you sell them the future, right? You don't talk about what it actually does, you talk about what an amazing world they'll live in once they buy it, right? And this absolutely was the key to Edison's success, right? Time and time again, defining the future for Americans, right, by talking about what kinds of things they would have, what kinds of lives they would have once the technologies that he was selling were purchased. Could I get the timer running down, by the way? And it turns out that, of course, once this became obvious, people were like, well, who knows about the future? Who can we, hire to tell us about the kind of future our product might bring to the world? And, there were already, in the early 1900s, futurists. And many of them were deeply idealistic. When you go back and read the kinds of things that people in the late 1800s, early 1900s were wrestling with in terms of the kinds of problems they saw emerging from industrial civilization, they were deeply engaged with moral issues, right? And they wrote books and lectured and so on and so forth, trying to get people to understand the trade-offs they were making. This didn't last very long. Pretty quickly, companies started figuring out that if they could make that kind of impassioned pitch for the future of, say, socialized medicine, that they could make that kind of pitch for other products. So you have, for example, H.G. Wells, a couple decades later in his life, appearing in a series of sort of trading card-like advertisements talking about various futures, right? So it was the age of power and wonder, and he was talking about things, like space travel and robots and a war on cancer. Ironically, you'll notice who the sponsor of this particular campaign is, which is Max Cigarettes. And this sort of started accelerating more and more until by the 60s and 70s, we started seeing actual corporate futurists, right? People who built their careers on the idea that they would go to a company, right? And they would help that company think about the future, and they would help that company talk to others about the future they were making. And this has become a very profitable business. I've cashed a few of these checks myself. But what you get when you have futures for hire are four things. You tend to get a lot of internal strategy marketing, right? So you've got a CEO who wants to take things in a certain direction, and he'll hire futurists to come in and help him describe the future of the company to the rest of the company, right? That's bread and butter for a lot of people. There's, of course, marketing, right? There's tons of marketing. I encourage you in the next couple weeks to pay attention to advertisements and how often they actually are about the future you will have once you buy this gizmo. And I would submit to you that it's very frequently either that or a bikini babe next to a car. A lot of other futures are loss leaders for futurists, right? So futurists know they need to get their name out there, so they'll describe some amazing possible future in order to get the attention of people who might hire them to do one of the first two things. And very distantly, there are people who are seriously engaged with trying to understand what might be coming and what we might want to do in advance of it. Most of the time, right, the vast majority of people who are professionally engaged with thinking about the future have a deep conflict at the heart of what they do, right? Because we have to market and sell and put forward the kinds of futures that the people who will hire us think are compelling, right? And this matters. This matters a lot because every future is not actually about the future. It's a frame for thinking about the present, right? Every future is a story about the possibilities and responsibilities of the present moment seen in a new way. And what you start to have in these situations is a sort of rewriting of those possibilities and responsibilities. And this, has brought out a real kind of weirdness in our culture, right? Where people understand that these old futures that we see again and again and again and again are no longer vital in the same way that they once were, right? And so we have fun things like, steampunks going out there and embracing the future that never was from back in the 1900s or what have you. But this kind of thing, right, this whole sort of slipstream thinking has really has become a major current in our cultural debate about where we're going. And one of the reasons why is because it makes us feel good, right? We live in times of profound uncertainty, and it is an instantaneous cure, if you will, to think about futures that feel comfortable, reassuring. We've seen them a million times before. We go, oh, okay, yes. So if you watch, the Sci-Fi Channel or something like that, every one of those futures, you know what's going to happen in that future, right? That's part of the draw. It's just which kind of alien is going to eat the second hero, right? And the consequence, though, of this can be very serious. Because futures can also be used to define away responsibilities, right? So one of the things that early industrialists did with their futures was basically say, we don't have to care about this because we're headed to a much brighter future, and we can't let little things like child labor get in the way of that, right? I would argue that today we are in a very similar situation, and the thing that's being defined away as a responsibility is the fact that we are setting in motion numerous forces that we know will be extremely detrimental to those who come after us. That, in the words of Paul Hawken, we have set up an economy where we steal the future, sell it in the present, and call it GDP. Right? It's an intergenerational Ponzi scheme, basically. And yet, again and again and again, these sorts of responsibilities are defined away. Increasingly, right, we also are finding people defining and limiting the scope of possibility. So for the last 30 years, there's been a fairly large industry of people who are paid to lie about the climate. Climate denialists, other professional PR people. It's a pretty sad and sordid history if you actually go read it. But it hasn't really worked. It's slowed things down, it's made life difficult for environmentalists and so forth. But fundamentally, most people, in the developed world at least, now understand that climate change is real. Most people would like to see action, etc. And so the idea that we can just, that a paid spokesperson can just say, no, 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 climate change isn't happening. It's all sunspots. It's all, ancient forces being, magnetized out of the earth. I mean, the crackpot theories are insane. Doesn't work. So where has that money gone, right? If they can't define away the responsibility to think clearly about the kind of climate we're leaving for the next 1,000 to 10,000 years, what we define away are the possibilities. So you see a huge amount of money, right, pouring into talking about geoengineering, into talking about how we can use, artificial volcanoes, huge screens in space, giant algal blooms in the ocean fed by iron filings, etc., to deal with the problem that we're not going to stop our emissions. Right? Many of the scientists who are doing this work are quite earnest about the fact that we need to stop our emissions and may need this as well. But that's not how it's playing out in the public debate. It's playing out in the public debate that this is a plan B, because plan A, which is slash our emissions, isn't practical. Right? This is an application of the future to limit our sense of what's possible in the present. And this is not unique. There are many, many of these things. But does the future have to be negative, limiting? Does it have to define away our responsibilities? Does it have to define away the possibilities that we have to make the world better? I think it doesn't. And I think that one of the things that we've seen is the development of a big foresight gap. Right? So there are people who talk about the future and are listened to, and what they describe as the future is, at best, when well-intentioned, ideas that were really hip and interesting 40, 50, 60 years ago, right? But clearly, there are also many, many people out there who really want to know, how do we engage the future in a meaningful way? How do we begin to see the opportunities that are actually there in meeting our responsibility and in embracing the possibilities that we have in front of us? How do we actually start to look at this wave of transformation that's sweeping through the world? Profound transformation. Right? We are moving into a different era, beyond the industrial era. And what that is, I can't say. First person to coin that's going to have a best-selling book. But the reality is that every person in this room knows things are not as they once were. And in some pretty powerful ways. And if we can't find futures to allow ourselves to illuminate the possibilities, we won't build those futures. You can't build what you don't imagine. And so, in the immortal words of George Clinton, the sage of all things futuristic, I encourage you to free your mind and your ass will follow. Thank you very much.